So I told her about me starting that fight on the playground, about pushing that fifth grader, and about how the other kids got in trouble and I didn't because she said she knew that it wasn't my fault, when it really was. Mrs. Carp leaned back again and put her fingertips together. Ah, yes, I can see how that would be a problem. Even though I didn't see you push anyone. And before that, the assembly. And then the lunchroom business. My goodness, this has been quite a week for you, hasn't it, Jake? And I nodded and said, yeah, really. Mrs. Carp stood up and walked around her desk. Well, you'd better get back to class, Jake. I'll do some thinking about this. Maybe we can talk some more at lunchtime. At lunchtime? I asked. Should I come to the office then? Mrs. Carp was quiet a moment, and then she said, no, I'll come and find you, all right. And I'm glad you were brave enough to come and talk to me. And I could tell Mrs. Carp kind of wanted to pat me on the head, but she didn't. And I was glad. When I got back to the classroom, it was free period. Some kids were reading, some were drawing or building with Lego blocks, and Shelley and Ben were working on the computers. I went back and stood next to Ben, looking over his shoulder at the screen. When he saw me, I asked, fixed it yet? He didn't take his eyes off the screen. Yeah, it was simple, but I'm pretending it's real hard that way. I might get you coming over at lunchtime. Then I can play a game. Ben took his hand off the keys and reached into his pocket. Looking around to be sure Mrs. Snaven wasn't watching, he pulled out a CD-ROM and showed it to me. It was Battle Tanks. I always have a copy of this with me, just in case, and he grinned. It was Thursday, so we didn't have art or gym. After free time, we watched a social studies video about these explorers named Lewis and Clark, and it was like this long adventure story, except it was all true. Morning was going great, and the best part was I could tell the kids in my class didn't think I was the teacher's pet anymore. But the minute I went out into the hallway to go to lunch, some kids from Mrs. Fro's class saw me, and this boy said, "Hey, look, it's Jakey Drakey. Gonna eat lunch with your girlfriend, Miss Scott, today?" And then three of our fifth grade kids started saying, Jake Drake, Jake Drake, Jake Drake. And one of the boys knocked my lunch out of my hands, and an apple rolled out of the bag. I wanted to start punching people, but I didn't as I picked up my lunch and headed for the cafeteria. I thought, maybe things are better in my own classroom. But what about all the other kids and all the other teachers? It felt like everyone else in the school was going to think I was a teacher's pet for the rest of my life. The lunchroom wasn't any better. In the milk line, a fourth grader asked me how come I wasn't cleaning tables yet. Then a fifth grade kid said, "Hey, look, it's the original garbage guy." And when I was walking over to where Willie was sitting, a girl in Mrs. Fro's class said, "Hey, Jake, Miss Cut was talking about you in art class today. She says you are so sweet." And then a whole bunch of girls started to giggle. I sat down and tossed Willie his chocolate milk. I said, "Hi, so you think it's safe to sit with me today?" Yeah, I yeah, I think so. Looks like you're still famous. I nodded and bit into my peanut butter sandwich. Yeah, guess I'm gonna have to learn to live with it. I leaned my head back to take a long drink of milk, but I stopped. Something was wrong with Willie, with his face. Willie looked like one of those kids in Jurassic Park when the Tyrannosaurus Rex is trying to eat their car. I put my milk carton down and said, "What's wrong?" And Willie whispered, Mrs. Carp coming this way fast." I turned around, and Willie wasn't kidding. Mrs. Carp was headed across the cafeteria. Every kid was watching her. She had this awful look on her face, and she was walking fast and in a straight line toward us. She came right up to me, and I could feel my face turned white. My heart was pounding. Mrs. Carp glared down at me. She was so tall, and it was like her face was made of stone. Without saying a word, she reached down and took hold of my arm right above the elbow. Then, real loud, she said, "You are coming to the office with me right now." Willie looked like he wanted to crawl under the table. Then Mrs. Carp turned around and started walking. She was still holding onto my arm, and it probably looked like she was dragging me across the cafeteria. And as we walking past with everyone staring at me, in this loud voice, Mrs. Carp said, "We have some things to talk about, young man, about the rules in gym class, and about your behavior in the art room, and about something that happened Tuesday out on the playground." I looked up, and at one of the lunch tables, Danny Gronson was smiling at me and nodding his head. Then he put out his pointer finger and pulled it, zip, straight across his throat. As Mrs. Carp pulled me across the big room, I felt myself start to blush, and I thought, that's the last time I'll ever crush a principal. I thought I was so smart to go and talk to her now. She's probably going to call my mom and dad too. Then we were out the door, down the steps, along the front hallway, and into her office. I hate it when I feel like I'm going to cry, especially at school, but that's how I felt. I kept off Mrs. Carp's desk, and when I heard her sit in her chair, I looked up at her. Then I looked away real quick, and then my eyes then looked back again, because I couldn't believe my eyes. Mrs. Carp was smiling, a big, warm, friendly smile. I kept staring at her, and she said, "How was that?" I shook my head. "What? How was what?" "My performance." "How did you like my performance?" And Mrs. Carp kept on smiling. "I guess it was pretty good if it fooled you too. Sorry, but I had to make it look real." I shook my head, still trying to understand. "Then you're not mad at me?" That she shook her head, still smiling. "No, no, not at all. Remember this morning when I told you I'd think about you problem? Well, I did. And what just happened? That was my solution. And that's when I got it. It was all an act," I said. "But the ropes in gym class, I really did that," Mrs. Carp said. "I talked with Mr. Collins, and he understands everything, and you will be doing more push-ups and sit-ups tomorrow." "An art class?" I asked. "Yes, Miss Cutt will be making quite a big speech to you on Friday about how wrong it was to destroy school property," which is true. Of course, you shouldn't have broken that paintbrush. Then Mrs. Carp looked at her watch. "Well, I think it's safe for you to go back and have the rest of your lunch now. But remember, Jake, this has to be our secret, or it's going to look like I've given you special treatment, and we wouldn't want anyone to think that. Now, would we?" And at the moment, if Mrs. Carp had wanted to pat me on the head, I wouldn't have minded it one bit. So that was how the longest 4 days of my life finally ended, and I never told anyone about Mrs. Carp's great performance, not even Willie. The rest of my lunch tasted great that Thursday, and I wish you could have seen the way everyone looked at me when I walked back into the cafeteria and sat down to eat. Some kids looked at me like I was an escaped criminal. Some kids looked at me like I was a hero coming back from a war. Some kids looked at me like they were afraid to look at me. But nobody, no one, not one kid, not one teacher, not one cafeteria lady looked at me like I had even ever been Jake Drake, teacher's pet.